To say that the 1914 doctrine is important to Jehovah's Witnesses is quite an understatement. And to stress how important this doctrine is to them, it would suffice to use the Watchtower Society's own words. One article says that approved association with Jehovah's Witnesses requires that you accept 1914. Another says that 1914 is one of the fundamental truths that we must hold to today. And another article goes so far as to say that if you don't accept 1914 in addition to their entire range of teachings, you will be destroyed in the Great Tribulation. And so in light of these quotes, it's no stretch to say that according to the Watchtower Society, your very salvation depends on accepting 1914. And because of such statements, would we not expect the doctrine of 1914 to be based on the most solid biblical reasons? And would we expect our salvation to be based on something that's doubtful or speculative? So let's investigate 1914 and see if it's based on the best possible reasons. And I would encourage all Jehovah's Witnesses watching this to do their own homework and examine the scriptures to see whether these things are so. That is, don't take anyone's word for it. Do your own research and come to your own conclusions. With that said, I'd like to use the Watchtower publication, What Does the Bible Really Teach?, in our investigation. And though much more detailed explanations are given elsewhere, I think most Jehovah's Witnesses would agree that this publication contains one of the best and most concise explanations of this doctrine. And beginning on page 215 in What Does the Bible Really Teach?, it says, decades in advance, Bible students proclaimed that there would be significant developments in 1914. What were these, and what evidence points to 1914 as such an important year? Now there's a few things to note about this statement. First of all, it's misleading. And it's quite an understatement to suggest that the early proclamations of 1914 were of quote-unquote significant developments. And though it's true that 1914 did bring about World War I, this was not something that was foretold by either Charles Taze Russell or the Bible students, which are now known as Jehovah's Witnesses. Instead, the facts clearly reveal that the Bible students were predicting something much more significant and specific. That is, the Battle of Armageddon and the end of the world. And unfortunate as this was, they credited the teaching, which we now know to be false, to God Himself. Second, in addition to understating the facts pertaining to the early proclamations of 1914, this publication seems to give the impression that the Bible students were doing something commendable in their proclamation. And the question I would ask is it commendable to be proclaiming a false doctrine and attributing it to God? Last, given that the Society has had a pretty poor track record of falsely pointing to dates that were supposed to have specific fulfillments, do you not find it to be at least questionable that the Society teaches that you must accept what they are now teaching about 1914 to be a true Christian? We continue in the publication. As recorded at Luke 21:24, Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled. Jerusalem had been the capital city of the Jewish nation, the seat of rulership at the line of kings from the house of King David. However, these kings were unique among national leaders. They sat on Jehovah's throne as representatives of God himself. Jerusalem was thus a symbol of Jehovah's rulership. How and when, though, did God's rulership begin to be trampled on by the nations? This happened in 607 BCE when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. Jehovah's throne became vacant, and the line of kings who descended from David was interrupted. And the first obstacle we have to deal with is that 607 date. And this is one very important link in the 1914 chronology, which, if the date's proven to be false, then the doctrine of 1914 is false. And in light of the Watchtower's declaration that your status as a true Christian depends on accepting 1914, should we expect to find a link in a chain that's made out of very thin rope instead of steel? And the truth is, that date of 607 is at worst completely false and at best questionable. And it's not my intention to go into all the details surrounding this date, but it must be emphasized that the vast majority of historians, whether they're biblical historians or secular historians, they date the destruction of Jerusalem at 586, 587, as opposed to 607 BC. And much has been written and debated from both sides of this issue, which is far too complex for our purposes here. So I would only ask that you do your own research on the subject and look at both sides of the issue and come to your own conclusions on the matter. But leaving aside that date of 607, there's some other questionable issues at hand, namely the trampling on the nations that is spoken of by Jesus. And the publication states that this trampling occurred in 607 BCE. But notice the time tense that Jesus places on the statement. He says that Jerusalem will be trampled. That is, Jesus is speaking in the future tense. So how could Jesus be speaking of something in the future, that is the trampling of the nations, that according to the publication happened hundreds of years before Jesus ever came to earth? Well, the publication doesn't tell us. In addition, there are other clues in the context of Jesus' statement that gives us even more reason for believing that he's speaking of something that's going to happen in the future. He says, beginning in verse 23, "Woe to the pregnant women and the one suckling a baby in those days, for there will be a great necessity to this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, and Jerusalem will be trampled on the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled." So given all of these future tense phrases that are found in the passage, is there any good reason to view this trampling as some sort of exception in referring to a past event? And in light of this, have we observed any solid evidence so far in the publication summary? Or have we seen statements that are questionable, if not false? And what would the scriptures teach about such things? 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, "Make sure of all things." In other words, should we not, as Bible students, examine the Watchtower's claims critically and make sure that it aligns with Scripture? And if it doesn't, or if we find reasons given to be questionable, should we not be a little more hesitant to join in with an organization that claims our very salvation to be dependent on this doctrine?